Hello everyone, welcome to this little tutorial to make these shipping crate type things for Warhammer, Necromunda, or any 28mm-ish sci-fi skirmish game. I've seen many people put these old Necromunda bulkheads to good use, so I thought I'd try my hand at it, as, well, I've got a few. I'm going to be mainly using this thick cardboard, also known as graphics medium chipboard, to join two bulkheads together and for most of the embellishments. Unusually for me, I made a little test piece before moving on to Illustrator to make the templates. This turned out to be a good idea, as I discovered several things that weren't immediately apparent about the measurements, and how the card would slot into the bulkhead. I used this experience to create my templates in Illustrator, and printed out the 3 copies I'd require. These were then glued onto card, and the laborious process of cutting could begin. I have to say, even with a fresh blade, this stuff is not fun to cut out, but smash some loud music on, and get in the zone, and learn to enjoy the wrist ache. Once everything is cut out, all of the ends can be slotted into the first bulkhead. You'll need to do one side, then the other, or it just doesn't work. I may have discovered this the hard way. I found that the card would stay in without the need for glue, so I decided against it. I also discovered, at this point, I'd failed to account for the extra 2-ish millimeters I needed on top of the central columns. This is adjusted in the templates, which I'll drop a link to in the description. Next, I added some PVA into the gap between the walls and the roof, pushed it down, and smoothed out the squidged out glue. Once this had dried, all the rest of the bits were glued on too. I then moved on to adding the rivets, or studs. For this, I used a pack of these half spheres. I think they're used in nail art. Anyway, you can get a huge amount of them quite cheaply, and this pack has a nice variety of sizes. I've used the 2mm and 3mm, I think. They go a really long way to add interest to what could become some really dull surfaces. To glue these down, I put down a blob of PVA from a cocktail stick, and then, using the slight stickiness, I picked it up and placed the rivet. This is another one of those jobs where you need to get a little bit zen, space out and get on with it. I think I'm a bit strange because I really love it. Once I'd made all 3, I decided they needed a little variation. The easiest way to do this was to change the appearance of the windows and doors. I used some corrugated card to emulate shutters, and broke up the window shapes with strips of card, with the detailed part of zip ties. Zip ties are really cheap to buy in bulk and can be used for all sorts of things. I highly recommend having a couple in your cupboard. Now, for the spaces in the roof. I wanted to add some hazard stripes because is it really an industrial object if it doesn't have hazard stripes? For this, I printed out a template to use as a stencil. The paper was liberally covered in sellotape to protect it from the paint. The gaps for the black paint were then cut away. This way, when I come to paint the roof, I can paint the hazard stripes and paint the main roof separately, before glue and final weathering. Looking back on this, I think you could easily get away with printing hazard stripes in colour, as many times as needed, and then simply sandwiching the print between the main roof and the underfloor. The main containers were then primed white with some artist's gesso, and base coated in solid colours. Yes, one is bright pink. I then stippled on some chipping with a sponge to make them a little more grungy. I focused the chipping on the parts that might experience the most wear, but also anywhere I thought needed a bit of interest added. I used a creamy white for the pink and green containers, and a medium grey for the light container. I think in hindsight I possibly could have gone a bit darker or a bit lighter with these, and increased the contrast, but I think it turned out okay. Next, the hazard stencil was carefully placed on the inner roof and stippled with dark grey. Even though I've used this technique before, I'm always surprised by how well it works, even if it is a little bit fiddly. Now I was trying my best to keep the paint jobs on these simple. I have a bit of a habit of trying for a masterpiece on everything, and whilst I don't think it's the worst trait ever, it does tend to slow everything down. Keeping this in mind, I still wanted to pick out just a few details, including the door terminals, to make sure they weren't too plain. After this, I went in and painted a little silver onto the areas of greatest damage on the paintwork. Again, a little on the overcomplex, fiddly, and not really worth it side of things, but I just couldn't help myself. Before proceeding with any further weathering, I decided now was the time to glue the outer roofs in place. The layers of glue and paint made them a little tricky to get in, but did result in a very snug fit. Next, I wanted to deal with the windows. To prime the windows for a later step, I painted them blue. I'd wanted this to be lighter in the middle and darker at the edges, but it was only really possible on the square windows, and I don't think it made a huge amount of difference anyway. Once all the paint had dried, I moved on to the first step of weathering, adding a dirty wash to all of the recesses and adding some drips and dirty bits of detail. The trick here is not to overdo it. Then I came back to the windows, mixing blue and black ink with a gloss medium. I added this in a thick layer to form a glassy effect. I think there are probably much better ways of doing it, but I'm happy enough with how they came out, and I only ended up using things that I had at hand. Lastly, because I couldn't stop, could I mixed water, PVA, pastel pigment, and flock to make some moss. This was liberally daubed on the containers, again being careful not to overdo it. And there we have it. I think for the effort versus effect, these are a great result. The Necromunda bulkheads really give you that head start on the detail and construction. I would possibly have chosen less bright colours, maybe, but hey, not everything has to be totally grimdark, right? Anyway, I've got a few more ideas for my massive bag of bulkheads, so if you'd like to see what I come up with next, hit that subscribe button. See you next time, YouTube.